Imagine you're sitting in a crowd of 80,000 people. The sun is hammering down on you. The smell of sweat and blood and sand is so thick you can almost taste it. You're in Rome. The year is 80 AD, and the whole city has shown up. Senators, merchants, slaves, soldiers, children, all packed inside the greatest arena the world has ever seen, the Colosseum. The roar is deafening, not polite applause, something more primal, something that comes out of the throat without permission. Then the gates open. Two men walk out onto the sand. One carries a net and a trident, the other a short sword and a shield. They may have trained together, eaten together, slept in the same barracks. None of that matters now, because the crowd didn't come here to watch friendship. They came to watch one of these men die. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The emperor is watching, sitting in his private box, draped in purple, completely calm. And when it's over, when one man is bleeding out on the sand, looking up at 80,000 faces, it's that emperor who decides with a single movement of his hand whether he lives or dies. A thumb, that's all it takes. This is Rome, where life was the cheapest currency in the richest empire the world had ever built, where a man could be a hero at noon and a corpse by sunset. But here's what most people get completely wrong. The gladiators, the blood, the spectacle, that was just the entertainment. The real story of Rome is bigger, darker, and far more fascinating than anything that happened in that arena. An empire that ruled 70 million people, that built roads still standing today, that created laws still shaping the modern world, that fielded the most disciplined army in human history, conquered everything in sight, and then lost it all.
Oh, and real quick, this channel is just getting started. If this kind of storytelling is something you're into, hit subscribe. Doesn't cost you anything, and it genuinely means everything at this stage. We're building something here, and I'd love for you to be part of it from the beginning. Now, back to Rome.
Over the next hour, we walk through every chapter of that story. The glory, the genius, the corruption, the collapse. All of it. So get comfortable, because once this starts, you won't want to stop. The world of ancient Rome was not built on marble alone, nor on the echoing speeches of emperors or the roar of the crowds in the Colosseum, but on the steady, rhythmic march of the legions, an unstoppable machine of flesh, iron, and discipline that held together an empire stretching from the deserts of Africa to the cold mists of Britannia. Before the first light touched the 7 hills, before even the city's market stirred to life, there were men standing in formation, their armor cold against their skin, their eyes trained on the horizon where wars were born and empires were kept alive. The Roman legion was more than a fighting force. It was a living organism, breathing through thousands of synchronized hearts, and it moved with a precision that few armies in history could match. They came from every corner of the Republic, farmers, blacksmiths, sons of shepherds, and men who had nothing but the promise of a steady wage and the dream of citizenship. Each one carried a piece of Rome's ambition in his kit. When a recruit joined the legions, he was stripped of his individuality. His name, his accent, his home, all were secondary to the red of his tunic and the discipline burned into him through training. The first days were harsh, deliberately so. Roman instructors believed that a man must be broken before he could be rebuilt, and so the training fields outside of Rome echoed with shouts, the clash of wooden swords, and the hollow thud of shields taking blow after blow under the Mediterranean sun. Every mistake was punished with lashes, every hesitation corrected by exhaustion, until the recruit learned not to think but to move as ordered, swift, obedient, efficient. The backbone of the legion was not just its courage, but its structure, a perfect hierarchy that made chaos impossible. 10 cohorts formed a legion, each cohort containing 6 centuries, and each century led by a centurion whose voice could cut through the din of battle like a blade through silk. These centurions were veterans, men whose scars spoke for them, who had faced death and returned with no illusions about glory. They wore crests of horsehair, and when they walked among their men, silence followed. To disobey a centurion was to invite pain. To earn his praise was to touch immortality. Discipline was sacred, for in the eyes of Rome, a single soldier breaking formation was more dangerous than 100 enemies. In the morning drills, the air was thick with dust, sweat, and the smell of oil from polished armor. Rows of men advanced and retreated in unison, their sandals striking the ground with mechanical rhythm, their rectangular shields locking together into a wall that no spear could pierce. Behind that shield wall they practiced stabbing with short gladii, never slashing, for the Romans knew a thrust killed faster and cleaner. The legionary strength was not in wild courage, but in relentless precision. He did not fight for honor, but for Rome, and for Rome, every motion had a purpose. When the time came to march, the order was given in calm, practiced tones, and the legion would move as one, 20 miles a day, sometimes more, across blazing plains or freezing hills, their steps measuring the land they were destined to conquer. Each man carried almost half his body weight, weapons, armor, tools, rations, even stakes for building the nightly camp. And when night fell, they did not rest, they built. Every evening, no matter where they stopped, the legion erected a fortified camp with trenches, palisades, and precise alignment, as though expecting an attack at any moment. No Roman soldier ever slept unguarded, and no Roman camp ever looked temporary. To the enemies of Rome, the sight of a newly raised fort in the middle of nowhere was a message. The legions were coming, and they meant to stay. War, when it came, was not chaos, it was a choreography, brutal, efficient, and terrifying in its simplicity. Before battle, the legate would ride before his men, delivering commands in a voice that carried across the valley. Horns sounded, standards waved, eagles of gold glinting in the sun. Then came silence, heavy and waiting. The ground trembled as thousands of shields lifted and spears angled forward. The enemy, whether barbarian tribes or rival empires, often looked across the field and saw not men, but a wall, unfailing, unflinching, advancing with the slow inevitability of a tide. And when that wall met resistance, it did not shatter, it absorbed. The front ranks locked shields, the rear ranks replaced the fallen. Arrows rained, but the testudo, the tortoise formation, rose a dome of iron over human lives. And then, with measured rhythm, the gladii struck from beneath, stabbing forward again and again, cutting through disarray with cold precision. Yet for all their perfection, the life of a legionary was misery. His rations were coarse bread, vinegar, wine, and salted pork. His pay was often late, his body scarred by endless campaigns. Disease killed more soldiers than blades, and many would never see Rome again. But still they marched, bound by oath, the sacramentum, to serve for 20 years. To break that oath was treason, not only to the state, but to the gods themselves. The fear of dishonor was stronger than fear of death. Even in retreat, the legions did not run. They withdrew methodically, step by step, shields still locked. Their courage was not the courage of heroes, but of men who could not afford to fail. In the heart of the legion marched the standards, the eagles of Rome, carried by chosen men whose duty was sacred beyond words. To lose the eagle in battle was a stain on eternity, a disgrace that outlived generations. Every man around it would rather die than let it fall. When a standard bearer was cut down, another seized it instantly, and if none remained, a centurion would plant it in the ground and fight to the death beside it. These eagles were more than symbols, they were the soul of Rome, and wherever they flew, Rome's presence was absolute. For those who survived long enough to retire, the reward was citizenship and a small plot of land, a modest gift for decades of service, but one that bound them forever to the empire they had built.
Many settled in distant provinces, their Latin mixing with local tongues, their children becoming part of Rome's vast mosaic. The empire expanded not only by conquest, but by the quiet spreading of Roman life itself. Roads, aqueducts, towns, all built by hands that once wielded swords. Even in peace, the legions remained busy, constructing the world they had once conquered. But perhaps the most astonishing part of the legion's story was its endurance. Empires before Rome raised armies, but none lasted as long, none operated with such ruthless organization, and none left such a deep mark on history. From Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul to Trajan's conquests in Dacia, the legions were everywhere, adapting, learning, and perfecting. Their methods influenced warfare for millennia, their discipline echoing even in modern armies. And though the empire eventually fell, though the eagles were lost and the standards buried, the image of the Roman soldier, his armor gleaming in the sun, his shield raised, his eyes fixed forward, never truly vanished. He remains in memory and in myth, the embodiment of control in a chaotic world, a reminder that civilization at its core is defended not by words or marble or gold, but by men willing to stand shoulder to shoulder, their lives given to something larger than themselves. And so the legend of the Roman legion endures in the dust of forgotten roads, in the crumbling ruins of old camps, in the faint echo of marching feet that history never quite managed to silence.
It always began with a trumpet, not the blare of glory or the cry of victory, but the dull, solemn sound that marked the beginning of something irreversible. A young man, perhaps no more than 17 or 18, would stand before the officers of the Roman Republic, his bare feet on the hard stones of the Forum, his hands trembling slightly as he waited for the order that would strip away his old life. The recruiters would move along the line of hopefuls with critical eyes, measuring shoulders, testing grip strength, studying faces for fear or hesitation. A single nod and a boy became a soldier. The others, too thin, too soft, too hesitant, would be dismissed with a curt gesture, swallowed again by the crowd of Rome. But the chosen ones, they would march forward, their hearts thudding like distant drums, knowing they were stepping into a world where mercy did not exist. The oath came next, the Sacramentum Militare. Before the eagle of Rome, polished until it burned in the morning light, each recruit would raise his right hand and swear loyalty not to himself, not even to the Senate or the people, but to the unseen immortal force of Rome itself. He swore to obey orders without question, to stand firm even when surrounded, to hold the line even when his brothers fell beside him. In that moment, the air around them seemed to still. The words, spoken in unison, echoed against the marble walls and seemed to sink into the earth. There was no turning back. From that day onward, his life belonged to the legion, and the punishment for cowardice was death. The sacramentum was not a promise, it was a surrender. They were taken from the city, then marched beyond the walls to the training camps, sprawling fields of dust and sweat where the old soldiers watched them with expressionless eyes. These were the veterani, men whose armor was dented, whose faces were cut by old scars, whose silence carried more weight than any shouted command. The recruits would be given their first tunic, rough wool dyed red, and a wooden sword heavier than any real one, its weight meant to carve endurance into their muscles. The training was endless, merciless, designed to break the weak and temper the strong. They marched until their feet bled, built walls under the burning sun, dug trenches with bare hands, and learned to sleep sitting upright, helmets still strapped beneath their chins. The Roman army did not care if they were noble or poor. It cared only for the ones who endured. In the first weeks, every mistake hurt. They learned the art of obedience before they learned the art of war. The centurions watched for hesitation, a late step, a crooked shield, a gaze that drifted when it should not, and punishment came swiftly. The vetus, a vine staff carried by every centurion, cracked across backs without warning. The sound was sharp and final.
There were no arguments, no explanations. A soldier who could not withstand pain was of no use to Rome. Yet beneath the brutality, there was a strange form of care, the belief that only through unrelenting discipline could a man survive the chaos of battle. Pain was the first teacher, but not the last. The training grounds were a theater of dust. Wooden swords clashed, shields slammed together, orders barked in the heat until voices went hoarse. They learned to stab, not swing. The gladius was a short blade built for precision, not for show. A single thrust beneath a rib could end a life faster than any dramatic slash. They learned to keep formation, to fight as a wall rather than as individuals. Each man's shield covered not only himself, but the soldier beside him. The strength of the legion was never in the man, it was in the unit. If one broke, all suffered. If one fell, another stepped into place without hesitation. They drilled until their bodies remembered what their minds could not. At night, the camp was silent except for the creak of leather and the crackle of distant fires. Recruits cleaned their armor, rubbed oil into their blades, and ate from the same pot of barley stew. The stars above the camp seemed impossibly distant, watching over 1,000 tiny lives being reshaped into something uniform and unyielding. There were friendships, but they were built on necessity rather than sentiment. The man who shared your tent might be gone tomorrow, cut down in a skirmish or collapsed from exhaustion. Grief was private, and Rome had little patience for it. The legion did not mourn, it replaced, and still the training continued. They were taught to march 20 miles under full load, to build an entire fortified camp before sundown, to disassemble it by dawn, and to do it again and again until their hands blistered and bled. They learned to dig moats and raise palisades, to measure ground with ropes and stakes so that every camp, no matter where in the empire, looked the same, perfect symmetry carved into foreign soil. Even in sleep, the Roman soldier lived by the grid. Order was everything. When the recruits had endured months of this ritual suffering, they were finally issued their real armor, the lorica segmentata. Bands of metal that wrapped around their chests, polished to a dull sheen. They were given their scutum, the large curved shield, and a pilum, the heavy throwing spear that bent upon impact to prevent the enemy from throwing it back. These were not gifts, they were burdens, symbols of belonging and responsibility. To lose them was disgrace, to wield them was purpose. There was one final ritual before a recruit became a true legionary, the mock battle. It was staged like the real thing, complete with drums, dust, and shouting officers. They fought not against enemies, but against each other, split into two sides and told to win by any means necessary. Wooden swords struck flesh, shields cracked, men fell hard onto the packed earth. There were bruises, broken ribs, bloodied noses, and sometimes even deaths. The commanders did not intervene. They watched, judging the cohesion, the obedience, the ability to maintain formation even in chaos. When the horn finally sounded and the mock battle ended, those still standing were no longer recruits, they were soldiers of Rome. From then on, life took on a rhythm as steady as the heartbeat of an empire. Dawn brought drills, midday brought construction, evening brought exhaustion, and in between there were moments of reflection, fleeting thoughts of home, of mothers and wives and the streets of childhood. But those thoughts were dangerous. The centurions said that memory was the enemy of duty. A man who longed for home fought less fiercely, hesitated when he should strike. The legion demanded not only the body, but the mind, and so the recruits learned to bury sentiment under ritual. They sang marching songs instead of prayers, carved their frustrations into the earth with every shovel thrust, and told themselves that Rome was eternal, that their suffering had meaning because it was for something greater than themselves. Slowly, imperceptibly, the transformation was complete. The awkward, uncertain boys who had arrived months earlier were gone. In their place stood soldiers whose faces were weathered, whose eyes no longer flinched at the sound of shouting, whose movements were identical in precision. When they marched now, the ground itself seemed to respond. the sound of hundreds of iron hobnails striking in unison, echoing like thunder. They had become extensions of the same will, the same law, the same empire. Rome had consumed them, reshaped them, and given them purpose. Occasionally, there were whispers among the tents, stories of past battles, of heroes whose names had been carved into stone, of legions that had vanished in foreign lands, swallowed by snow or sand. The recruits listened, half in awe, half in fear. Some wondered whether the gods watched over them, or whether Rome itself had become its own god, indifferent and all-powerful. But the centurions dismissed this concept with a growl. "Rome is what we make it," they said. "Rome is the men who march." Then came the day of departure. Orders were shouted, the camp stirred like a living thing, banners were unfurled, the eagle polished until it caught the sunlight like fire. The soldiers lined up in perfect rows, each carrying his full pack, each knowing that once the march began, it might not end for years. Families gathered on the outskirts, silent and watching, knowing that most would never return. The trumpets sounded again, that same mournful, inevitable tone that had started it all. And then they were moving, hundreds of them, boots thudding against the earth in the same exact rhythm. Dust rose behind them, swirling like smoke. Ahead lay the open world, the mountains of Gaul, the deserts of Syria, the dark forests of Germania. Somewhere out there, enemies waited, unaware of the disciplined storm that was coming for them. The recruits were no longer boys. They were part of something ancient and unstoppable, something that had already crushed 100 nations and would soon crush 100 more. And as they marched, the officers looked upon their ranks with pride and calculation. Each man was now a cog in the great machine of conquest, a blade sharpened by pain, loyalty, and belief. Together, they were the heartbeat of an empire, the rhythm by which the world itself would measure time. The legion had been born not in glory, but in blood, in dust, and in the quiet acceptance of men who had surrendered everything to something far greater than themselves. And far behind them, back in the quiet fields of Latium, the sound of marching feet faded into the wind, but Rome heard it still, echoing in her marble temples and across her restless seas, the pulse of a world.
The first battle always began with silence, not the kind that comforts, but the kind that presses against the chest and fills the air with something heavy, like the breath before a storm. Dawn was a pale line on the horizon, the color of steel and ash. The men stood in formation, armor gleaming faintly, shields touching edge to edge, forming a wall of iron that stretched across the field. Somewhere ahead, beyond the low mist, the enemy waited. They could not be seen yet, but their presence was undeniable. The faint sound of horns, the restless shuffle of feet, the distant murmur of voices carried by the wind. For the new soldiers, this was the moment when the body remembered fear. Their throats were dry, their hands slick against the handles of their shields. Some whispered prayers to Jupiter or Mars. Others simply stared forward, trying to keep their breathing steady. The veterans said that fear was not a weakness, it was a weapon. You had to hold it tightly, control it, turn it into focus. Only fools were fearless, and fools died first. Then the orders began. The centurions barked commands in short, cutting Latin. Lines shifted, shields lifted, spears angled. The sound of movement spread through the formation like the turning of gears inside a machine. There was no chaos, only precision. Every man knew his place, his timing, his role. This was the strength of Rome, 1,000 individual wills forged into one. And then came the horn, one long, unbroken note that cut through the morning like a blade. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then the storm broke. The front line advanced first, their shields locked, their steps perfectly in rhythm. The earth trembled beneath the synchronized pounding of hobnailed sandals. Dust began to rise, curling around the soldiers' legs as they moved faster, faster, until the entire formation was a moving wall of red and bronze.
The enemy surged forward to meet them, a chaos of screams and spears and flashing blades. The impact was like thunder. Shields slammed against shields, swords jabbed between the gaps. Men shouted, stumbled, fell, but the Roman line did not break. It absorbed the blow, then pushed forward one step at a time, an unstoppable rhythm of violence and discipline. Each legionary fought not as an individual, but as a part of the machine. Thrust, shield, thrust, step, thrust. The gladius was short, efficient, built for the close press of battle. There was no room for flourish, no space for hesitation. Every movement was designed to kill quickly, cleanly, without wasted motion. The air filled with the stench of iron and blood, the cries of the dying, the clash of metal on metal. Yet within that chaos, the Roman soldiers moved like a single organism. Centurions shouted from behind, their vine staffs striking the backs of shields to signal commands. The signifer held the banner high, the eagle gleaming through the smoke, a symbol that no man dared to let fall. Even when arrows rained down from the sky, the formation held. Shields lifted above their heads, forming the testudo, the tortoise, a living fortress of iron. The sound of arrows thudding into wood echoed like rain against a roof. To the men inside, it felt as if the world had narrowed to darkness and heartbeat. They could not see far, only the back of the shield in front of them, the arm of the man beside them, the brief flash of a sword thrusting through the gap. There was no room for thought, only instinct and command. The line advanced again and again, pressing the enemy backward with relentless force. The Romans fought to rhythm, the slow chant of the centurions, the grunts of effort, the steady drumbeat of order imposed upon chaos. When the front rank tired, the next moved forward seamlessly. The rotation was perfect, practiced endlessly in training fields far from this place. There was no break, no pause, no weakness. The enemy, wild and disorganized, began to falter. Their courage met the cold machinery of Roman discipline, and it shattered. But victory did not come easily. It never did. The ground became slick with mud and blood. Men slipped, were trampled, were crushed beneath the weight of shields. Splinters splintered, armor dented, screams pierced the smoke, and still the legion moved forward. They were trained to survive by repetition, to obey, even when the mind screamed for retreat. For hours the battle raged. When one horn blew, the pilum was thrown, a wave of heavy spears arcing through the air, their iron tips bending as they struck shields, rendering them useless. The enemy stumbled under the barrage, and that was when the legion charged. Swords flashed, the line crashed forward, the enemy's wall broke. What followed was not war, it was slaughter. The Romans advanced until the field itself gave way. The ground was littered with corpses, with armor, with the remnants of what had once been an army. And still the order came. Hold formation, hold rank, no pursuit without command. Emotion had no place here. They were not men of impulse, they were the embodiment of discipline. When the last horn finally sounded, signaling the end, the silence was deafening. The field was still, except for the groans of the wounded and the slow, steady breathing of the legionaries. Their faces were streaked with soot and sweat. Blood had dried on their hands, their armor, their sandals. They stood motionless, staring across the landscape they had conquered. Then came the counting. Officers walked among the ranks, checking for the missing, noting the fallen. The signifer lowered the standard slightly in silent honor of the dead. The priests moved through the lines, offering brief blessings, their words lost in the wind. For the men who remained, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. They cleaned their weapons, rebuilt their camp, and ate in silence. At night, the fires burned low. The smell of smoke mixed with the faint sweetness of wine. Some men stared into the flames, replaying the day's horrors in their minds. Others laughed too loudly, desperate to drown the echoes of screams. A few slept immediately, their bodies shutting down from sheer exhaustion. The centurions kept watch, pacing between the tents, ensuring discipline even in rest. The veterans said that the first battle always changed a man. Some became harder, colder, as if a part of them had been left on the battlefield.
Others found something new inside themselves, not courage exactly, but understanding. They realized that battle was not about rage or glory, it was about control. The man who could stay calm amidst chaos, who could keep his shield steady and his thrust precise, would live. The rest would not. And so the Legion learned. With every campaign, every march, every clash of shields, they became sharper, more unified. They adapted to every enemy, every terrain, every unforeseen storm. They learned to fight in forests and deserts, on mountains and plains, against chariots, cavalry, archers, and barbarians who fought naked and screaming under the moonlight. The Romans did not fear chaos. They studied it, dissected it, and turned it into strategy. Soon, their reputation spread like fire. Villages whispered of them long before they arrived. Kings built walls, tribes fled into the hills, and still the legions came, implacable, disciplined, efficient. The thunder of their march was the sound of history advancing. But the soldiers themselves thought little of empire. For them, survival was personal. Each battle was a test of endurance, each victory a brief moment of relief before the next campaign began. They fought because it was what they had been shaped to do, because Rome demanded it, because the alternative was unthinkable. When dawn came again, they would march once more. The horns would sound, the formations would form, the machine would awaken, and the world would tremble again before the unstoppable rhythm of the Roman legion. Forged not in the fire of gods, but in the sweat, blood, and unyielding will of mortal men.
The sound of conquest was steady and patient, not the thunder of chaos, but the measured rhythm of thousands of feet pressing into the dirt, moving forward without pause, without hesitation, the sound of Rome itself advancing across the world. The sky above them carried the dust of travel, and beneath it the land stretched open, rivers winding like veins of silver, forests breathing in slow silence, mountains rising like the bones of the earth itself, all of it destined to fall beneath the disciplined shadow of the legions. Everywhere they went, they carried order. Behind the shields came the engineers, the builders, the men who transformed wilderness into empire. When they crossed rivers, bridges rose within days. When they camped, cities began to take shape. Their presence alone reshaped the landscape, bending it into roads, fortresses, and outposts that linked the vastness of the world together into one unbroken Roman line. It was not just war, it was architecture, mathematics, faith in structure, faith in repetition, faith in something greater than any one soldier could comprehend. From the burning coasts of Carthage to the green mists of Britain, from the blazing sands of Africa to the frozen forests of the north, they moved like a tide. Villages watched them pass with fear and silence, and sometimes in that silence there was a strange kind of awe. For who else could march in such unbroken formation for days, armor glinting beneath a punishing sun, carrying the weight of empire on their backs, and still move as one? To the conquered, they were monsters, an unstoppable machine of blood and discipline. To themselves, they were the chosen, the ones who carried the flame of civilization into the wild dark. But even among them, whispers began to grow, quiet thoughts shared between men on long marches, that Rome had no horizon anymore. There was no end, no final victory. Every battle led only to another road, another campaign, another emperor's dream of immortality carved from other people's lands. Yet the soldiers marched. Their bodies remembered what their minds questioned. When the horns called, their hands reached for spears. When the commander spoke, they obeyed without hesitation. It was the only life they knew, this endless forward motion, this transformation of the unknown into the familiar. Every camp was the same, every trench dug the same way, every wall measured by the same rhythm. They could wake in any province of the empire and still find the same order, the same smell of oil and iron, the same firelight flickering across the same faces. In Gaul, they fought through forests so thick that light could barely find them, and when they burned their way through, they left behind not ashes, but roads.
In Germania, they learned that the land itself could be an enemy, swallowing entire legions into its mud and mist. In the east, they saw cities older than Rome, places of gold and marble that reminded them how small their lives truly were compared to the scale of what they were building. Everywhere they went, they left the same imprint. Roads like scars across the earth, the bones of fortresses that would outlast generations. The weight of discipline pressed into the soil itself. Rome did not just conquer, it rewrote the map, redefined the limits of endurance. At night, the camps glowed like constellations scattered across the empire. Fires flickered inside wooden walls. Men cleaned their weapons, mended their sandals, whispered prayers to forgotten gods. Some thought of home, though the memory of home had grown faint. Others spoke of the cities they had seen, of the generals they had followed, of the strange silence that came after victory, the silence that always felt too heavy, too hollow. There were no heroes among them, not really, just men doing what was expected, what had been done before, what would be done again. The glory belonged to the Senate, to the emperors, to the poets who would one day write their names in marble. The men who carried the spears, who built the bridges and died beneath foreign skies, they would not be remembered. But they understood something deeper, that glory was never the goal. Survival was, obedience was, order was. And yet, under the armor and the training, under the unyielding rhythm of the march, there were hearts beating, weary and restless, wondering when this march would end. For every empire that expands must one day face the edge of the world, the place where maps end, where ambition collapses under its own weight. The legions did not know it yet, but that edge was coming. For now, the horizon still called to them, that endless golden promise of one more conquest, one more border to erase, one more nation to bring beneath the Roman sun. And so, as the wind rolled across the fields and the banners caught the fading light, the sound of their march went on, steady, relentless, eternal, the heartbeat of an empire that believed itself immortal.
At the height of its power, Rome gleamed like a sun at the center of the known world. Every road, every trade route, every story somehow found its way back to her, as if all of history itself revolved around the heartbeat of that city. From the marble steps of the Forum to the farthest outpost in the desert, the empire stood vast, proud, and unbroken, an ocean of banners and soldiers and lore stretching farther than any one man could walk in a lifetime. The air in Rome smelled of heat and incense and ambition, a strange mixture of dust and divinity. Senators in white togas passed beneath columns carved with the faces of gods, debating the fates of nations as though they were chess pieces. In the streets below, merchants shouted over one another in a dozen languages. Sailors drank to their voyages, and slaves carried the weight of other men's dreams through the markets and the baths. Everything moved with purpose. Everything belonged to Rome. The legions had become more than soldiers. They were an idea, a living force that had shaped the world. To see a Roman formation approach on the horizon was to feel the ground shift beneath you, to understand that resistance was no longer bravery, but suicide. Cities opened their gates before the banners even came into view, and kings swore allegiance before their armies were crushed. The sight of that red standard, the glint of steel under the sun, it all meant the same thing. Rome had arrived, and there would be no turning back. But glory has a strange taste. It begins as triumph, bright, intoxicating, almost divine, and then it turns to iron on the tongue. The legions who once fought for survival now fought for pride, for territory, for emperors whose names they barely knew. Victories blurred together. One province conquered, another rebellion crushed, another border drawn and redrawn in blood. The empire had become a machine that could not stop moving because stopping would mean confronting what it had become. In the great arenas, the crowds roared as gladiators fell, their blood feeding the same hunger that once drove soldiers to war. Bread and spectacle became the heartbeat of the people.
their faith in the empire replaced by entertainment, their courage numbed by comfort. The senators still spoke of virtue, of destiny, of divine favor, but even their voices trembled now beneath the weight of gold. Too much had been taken. Too many lives had been poured into the foundations of Rome's greatness. Still, the illusion held. The aqueducts flowed with cold, clean water from mountains hundreds of miles away. The roads gleamed with the polish of centuries of marching feet. The cities glowed at night, lit by torches and the laughter of those who believed the world would never change. Even the gods seemed content. Jupiter's temples filled with offerings, Mars's altars red with sacrifice, Venus's statues adorned with roses and wine. Everything looked eternal, unshakable, as if time itself had bent the knee. And yet, beneath the marble and the music, something quieter was happening. A slow, invisible erosion like the sea eating away at the edge of a cliff. The soldiers who once fought for the glory of Rome now fought for coin. The borders that once burned with loyalty now trembled with unrest. The emperors who once led from the front now hid behind walls of silver and stone. The empire had reached its peak, and from this height, every direction led downward. Still, no one dared speak it aloud, not in the baths, not in the taverns, not even in the whispering corners of the barracks. To doubt Rome was to doubt the world itself. How could something so vast, so ancient, so perfectly built ever fall? The question felt absurd, dangerous, almost sacrilegious. And so the soldiers marched on, the senators schemed, the crowds cheered, and the world continued to turn beneath the golden weight of empire. At night, when the fires dimmed and the city sank into silence, there was a strange feeling that lingered. Not fear exactly, but something close to it, a collective shiver that passed through the stones and the streets. Perhaps it was the ghosts of all those who had built this empire, whispering in the dark. Or perhaps it was the empire itself, sensing the truth that everyone else refused to see, that even the greatest machine ever built by man could not outlast the hands that made it. The moonlight fell across the statues of emperors, across the shields hanging silent in the barracks, across the wide marble steps of the temples. And in that stillness, Rome looked eternal, perfect, indestructible. But history, like the tide, was already turning far beyond the horizon.
The cracks in the marble. Decay from within. In the heart of Rome, beneath the marble glow of temples and the hum of fountains, something was quietly beginning to rot. The streets still echoed with laughter and trade and the cries of street performers. But beneath it all, there was an unease, a vibration in the air that even the most loyal citizens could feel but never name. It was not the roar of barbarians beyond the frontier, nor the threat of a single enemy or revolt. It was the slow, patient collapse of purpose, the fading of that strange, sacred fire that had once burned in every Roman heart. The emperors had changed. Where once men of iron and discipline had stood, generals forged in the dust of battlefields, men who had marched alongside their soldiers through mud and blood and exhaustion. Now came emperors of silk and wine, of private feasts and whispered intrigue. They sat on thrones surrounded by gold and guarded by fear, their crowns growing heavier as their hearts grew softer. And yet, each claimed to be the voice of the gods, the chosen guardian of Rome's eternal destiny. The Senate bowed, the soldiers obeyed, and the crowds cheered because that was what Romans did, even when they no longer believed. The legions, too, had changed. The discipline that had once defined them, the unbreakable formations, the unity, the pride, was dissolving into something mercenary, something brittle. The ranks were filled not with Romans, but with strangers from the edges of the empire, men of distant deserts and cold northern forests who fought for pay and plunder rather than for the eagle standard. The old soldiers watched this transformation with quiet bitterness,
remembering when every blow they struck was for Rome itself. Now they struck for whoever held the purse strings. And in the provinces, governors grew fat and powerful, carving small kingdoms out of imperial neglect. They sent letters to Rome full of loyalty and devotion, but in the dark corners of their halls, they plotted their own survival, their own glory. The roads that once carried legions now carried rumors of corruption, of betrayal, of decay hidden behind the mask of marble perfection. Meanwhile, in the capital, the people drifted further from the spirit that had once defined them. The old Roman virtues, discipline, duty, restraint, had given way to appetite. The city that had once built empires now lived for spectacle. The Colosseum roared louder than the Senate. Blood and sand replaced law and vision. Thousands gathered to watch men die beneath the midday sun, cheering for death as if it were a sport, as if the empire's soul could be fed by slaughter. And perhaps for a while it was. The philosophers saw it coming. Men like Seneca, long dead by now, had warned that power without virtue would eat itself alive. But who listens to the dying when the feasts are full and the fountains still flow? The empire was rich beyond imagining. Gold poured in from Egypt, grain from Africa, silk from the East. To the common man, Rome seemed immortal, too vast to crumble, too divine to fade. They could not see the fractures that were spreading like veins beneath the marble floors, cracked so fine that they could only be felt by those who dared to walk barefoot through history. The gods, too, had grown silent. Temples still burned with offerings, but the prayers felt hollow, the rituals mechanical. The Romans prayed not for virtue or courage, but for pleasure, for fortune, for distraction. And as the old faith began to lose its hold, new whispers moved through the alleys and tenements, stories of one God, one Savior, one truth that no emperor could control. Christianity, still small, still hunted, had begun to take root in the shadows, offering hope where Rome offered only order. From the palaces on the Palatine Hill to the soldiers freezing on the northern frontiers, the empire was being pulled in two directions, one toward excess, the other toward exhaustion. And somewhere in between, the idea of Rome itself began to blur. What was it now? A city, its people, a power, or merely a memory still pretending to be alive? The marble statues still stood proudly in the squares, gleaming white in the sun. But if you looked closely, you could see it. Hairline fractures running down the necks of emperors, tiny chips gathering at the feet of gods. Time had begun to touch what Rome swore it could preserve forever. The fountains still poured water into their basins, but even the water seemed tired now, carrying the reflection of a city that no longer recognized itself. In the barracks, soldiers whispered that the pay was late again. In the villas, senators whispered that the emperor had lost his mind. In the temples, priests whispered that the gods were gone. And in the streets, the people stopped whispering altogether, for there was nothing left to say that hadn't been said before. Rome, in all its glory, had begun to echo. Its greatness had become a sound that repeated through time, beautiful, distant, hollow. The empire did not fall in a day. It began with the silence between those echoes, the spaces where pride turned to memory and memory turned to dust. And as the sun set over the Tiber that evening, painting the city in gold and shadow, it was still beautiful, breathtaking, eternal to the eye. But if you listened closely enough beneath the music and the laughter and the hum of the crowd, you could hear something else, something faint and final. It was the sound of marble beginning to crack.
There comes a point in every empire's life when expansion turns into exhaustion, when the weight of its own greatness becomes too heavy to carry.
And Rome, that magnificent, tireless machine of conquest and civilization, reached that point not with a single war or rebellion, but with the quiet, inevitable pressure of time itself. The empire had grown too vast, its borders stretching from the misted highlands of Britain to the burning sands of Arabia, from the frozen Danube to the deserts of Africa. And every road, every fortress, every province demanded more men, more grain, more gold, until the veins that once pulsed with the blood of conquest began to tremble under their own strain. The Emperor Diocletian saw what others would not, that the empire had grown too large for one mind, one will, one throne. He did not dream of conquest, he dreamed of survival, of order, of control. And so he did something unthinkable to those who still clung to the old idea of Rome's unity. He divided it east and west, 2 emperors, 2 courts, 2 Romes. To one, the Latin West, proud, scarred, filled with the old fire of the legions. To the other, the Greek East, wealthy, cultured, humming with trade and philosophy. What had once been a single body was now a pair of twins, joined by memory alone. At first, it worked. The East glittered like a new dawn, its cities flourished, its ports overflowed with silk, spice, and gold, and the new capital, Constantinople, rose like a dream of marble and domes above the Bosphorus, gleaming with ambition and divine favor. To the east, it seemed as though Rome had not weakened, but transformed, shedding its old skin to become something eternal, something almost celestial. But the West was growing old. The cities that had once defined civilization began to crumble. The aqueducts broke and were never repaired. The baths ran dry, the libraries fell silent, and the once proud roads were choked by weeds. The emperors came and went like shadows. Soldiers crowned them, soldiers killed them, and soldiers crowned the next. The legions were no longer Roman in blood or spirit. They were mercenaries from distant tribes, men who spoke strange tongues and swore hollow oaths. The eagle still flew above them, but it was not pride that held it aloft, it was habit. The frontiers were cracking. Across the Rhine and the Danube, the barbarian tribes had changed. They were no longer scattered raiders, they were nations in motion. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, restless, hungry, and watching. They saw the weakness in the Roman lines, the emptiness in the fortresses, the fear behind the walls, and they waited. The legions that once marched with the thunder of destiny now moved slowly, cautiously, unsure whether the men beside them were allies or mercenaries, Romans or strangers. Meanwhile, in the East, emperors still ruled with confidence. Their cities gleamed with mosaics and marble, their scholars debated theology beneath domed ceilings, and their fleets guarded the Aegean with iron and fire. The Eastern emperors watched the West's decay with pity, perhaps, but also with detachment, as if the fall of Rome proper were not their concern, as if they had become something new, something cleaner. Byzantium's heirs of Rome, but no longer its keepers. And so, the empire split, not only in power, but in soul. The West carried the memory of glory, the echo of triumph, the faded pride of legions long dead. The East carried the intellect, the faith, the unbroken wealth of trade and culture. 2 halves of one world, one dying of nostalgia, the other reborn in marble and light. But even in this division, there was tragedy. For what Rome had once been, that unbreakable force that bent the world beneath its will, could never truly exist in 2 places at once. The empire's strength had been its unity, the idea that one law, one language, one destiny could bind 100 peoples together. Without that, the borders became walls, and the walls became boundaries, and the boundaries became excuses. The empire no longer breathed as one body, it merely survived as 2. In the West, Farmers abandoned their fields, cities shrank, and roads fell silent. The old gods were gone, replaced by crosses of wood and whispers of salvation. Even the soldiers, once the image of iron discipline, now prayed before battle not to Mars or Jupiter, but to a single god who promised heaven instead of victory. And when the barbarians came, not as raiders, but as nations, many of those soldiers laid down their arms, believing, perhaps, that Rome had already fulfilled its destiny and had nothing left to defend. In the east, Constantinople's domes gleamed brighter than ever. The emperors there still called themselves Augustus, still claimed to rule the Roman world, and for a time it seemed they truly might. But even they could feel it, the sense that something vast had been lost, that the heart of the old empire had stopped beating, even if the mind still lived. And so the world split in two, east and west, sun and shadow, survival and memory. The empire had not yet fallen, but it was no longer whole. It had become an echo of itself, and like all echoes, it would fade slowly, beautifully, tragically, into the silence of history.
There were moments in history when silence spoke louder than battle, when the fall of an empire is not marked by the crash of swords or the cries of men, but by the quiet absence of them. And that was how Rome began to die. Not in flame and fury, but in exhaustion, in the slow retreat of order from chaos, of civilization from the wild. The legions that once stretched from the Tigris to the Thames were shadows of what they had been. Their armor was rusted, their pay uncertain, their loyalty thinner than their ranks. The soldiers were no longer sons of Rome, but strangers, Goths, Huns, Vandals, Alemanni, all wearing Roman steel, but dreaming of their own kings and their own gods. The very walls of Rome, once guarded by her own sons, now echoed with foreign voices, with men who had come to serve her and instead began to claim her for themselves. Across the northern borders, rivers of ice and hunger pushed entire peoples southward. Tribes displaced by other tribes, families fleeing the endless cold. They came not merely as raiders, but as migrants, as nations on the move. The Goths crossed the Danube in the thousands, seeking shelter beneath the Roman eagle, and Rome, tired, uncertain, desperate for allies, allowed them in. It was mercy. It was also the beginning of the end. They were promised food and land, but they found deceit and starvation. Roman officials cheated them, hoarded grain, treated them not as allies, but as beggars. And so the Goths rose in anger. The year was 378, and outside the small town of Adrianople, the empire met its reflection, not in glory, but in ruin. The legions marched under Emperor Valens, confident, proud, unshaken by the enemy they thought barbaric. But when the fighting began, the old discipline failed. The lines broke, the formations collapsed, and the emperor himself was burned alive in a farmhouse as his army died around him. Rome had faced many enemies, but never before had she lost so completely, so humiliatingly to those she had called lesser men. From that day forward, the empire no longer inspired fear, it invited it. The borders once drawn in steel began to blur. The Goths, once refugees, became conquerors. Alaric, their king, saw in Rome not just a city, but a symbol, the heart of a world that had forgotten its own strength. For years he negotiated with the emperors, demanding lands, payment, respect. For years they ignored him, and when his patience died, he turned his armies toward the city itself. It had been almost 800 years since Rome had seen a foreign army within its walls. The eternal city, heart of the world, queen of civilization, had forgotten what it meant to tremble. And yet, in 410 AD, as dawn broke over her 7 hills, the impossible happened. Alaric's men breached the gates. There was no grand defense, no epic last stand. The city fell not with defiance, but with disbelief.
Fires spread across marble avenues, temples were stripped, palaces looted. The cry of Rome has fallen swept across the world like a storm, and even those who had once hated her felt the echo of loss. But the truth is, Rome did not fall in a single night. She died as all great things die, slowly, painfully, piece by piece. The Vandals came next, sweeping across Africa, cutting off the grain supply that had fed Rome for centuries. The Visigoths settled in Gaul and Spain. The Franks rose in the north. The Huns, with faces hardened by the winds of the steppe, thundered into Europe under Attila, burning cities, slaughtering armies, leaving behind only ashes and terror. Rome had faced 1,000 enemies before, but now it faced the one thing it had never conquered: time. In the end, the last emperor of the West was not killed in battle, nor martyred for the glory of Rome. He was a child. His name was Romulus Augustulus, a name that carried both the birth and death of empire within it. Romulus, the founder of Rome; Augustus, the title of its first emperor. In the year 476 AD, he was quietly deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer. No grand speeches, no battle cries, just the quiet transfer of a crown that no longer meant anything. The Senate still sat, but it ruled no one. The eagle standards were taken east to Constantinople, where the emperors still called themselves Roman, but ruled a different world. The West lay in ruins, its cities abandoned, its aqueducts dry, its language fading into the tongues of conquerors. And yet, somehow, something of Rome survived. In the stones of her roads, in the law that governed her provinces, in the faith that grew in her dying breath, Christianity, the empire as ghost lived on. The barbarians who had torn down her walls began to rebuild upon them. The tribes who had once feared her began to wear her symbols, speak her language, dream her dreams. Rome had fallen, but the world she had created could not be unmade.
While the West was collapsing under the weight of its own decay, the East endured, not by chance, but by brilliance, by adaptation, by sheer force of will. The Roman Empire did not vanish in 476 AD. It transformed, hardened, and glittered anew in the city that Constantine had chosen more than a century before: Constantinople. Nova Roma, the new Rome. Built upon the bones of ancient Byzantium, this city was more than a capital, it was a statement. Rising from the meeting point of Europe and Asia, surrounded on three sides by water and guarded by walls so immense that no siege would break them for 1,000 years, Constantinople became a fortress of civilization. Within its marble halls, senators still debated, emperors still wore purple, and coins still bore the proud inscription Imperium Romanum. Here the empire did not die. It evolved. The legions were gone, replaced by the tagmata, professional soldiers loyal not to Rome's fading memory, but to a living emperor. Latin faded from their tongues, replaced by Greek, the language of philosophy, of trade, of the New Testament itself. And while the Western world descended into illiteracy and superstition, Constantinople became a beacon of knowledge, preserving manuscripts, teaching philosophy, maintaining libraries while the rest of Europe forgot how to read. The man who embodied this revival more than any other was Justinian I, who ruled in the 6th century and dreamed not merely of survival, but of restoration. To him, the empire's division was a wound that had to be healed. Under his command, armies under the general Belisarius reconquered Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and part of Spain from the Visigoths. For a fleeting moment, the Mediterranean once again shimmered as a Roman lake. But Justinian's greatness was not measured only in war. His true empire was one of law and stone. He codified centuries of Roman jurisprudence into the Corpus Juris Civilis,
a legal foundation that would shape the West for 1,000 years. And he built the Hagia Sophia, the great church with a dome so vast that when the light of morning poured through its windows, it seemed less a building than a vision of heaven itself. Yet the world outside was changing. The empire stood at the crossroads of continents, and at its gates, new powers were rising. Persia to the east, the Lombards in Italy, the Slavs along the Danube, and soon the Arabs in the deserts of the south. The wars that followed were endless. Cities burned, borders shifted, and the wealth that had once filled the coffers of emperors drained away like sand through open hands. But still, Constantinople endured. When the armies of Islam swept across the Middle East, crushing Persia and taking Egypt and Syria, they reached the very walls of the city. In 674 and again in 717, fleets surrounded the Golden Horn. The Byzantines, outnumbered and outmatched, unleashed their greatest secret: Greek fire. A weapon so terrifying that it could burn even upon the sea. The invaders fled, leaving behind charred ships and terror. For centuries, the formula remained a state secret, whispered only among imperial engineers. Byzantium was not the Rome of Caesars. It was something more cunning, more flexible, a creature of survival. Its emperors ruled not only with the sword, but with marriage, diplomacy, religion, and gold. Spies crossed borders disguised as monks or merchants. Treaties were sealed with the hands of daughters given to foreign kings. The empire became a chessboard of intrigue, its every move calculated, its every loss turned into patience. Its faith became its soul. When Emperor Constantine first embraced Christianity, he had bound the empire to a new god, and in Byzantium, that god found his earthly home. The Hagia Sophia became the center of Christendom, its mosaics shimmering with golden light. Icons, chants, incense, these were not mere decoration, but a bridge between earth and eternity. To step into a Byzantine church was to step into the divine. Yet, even the eternal flame flickers. The Crusades, meant to defend the faith, turned against Byzantium itself. In 1204, the unthinkable happened. Western knights, driven by greed and vengeance, sacked Constantinople. For 3 days, the greatest city in Christendom was looted, its churches defiled, its relics stolen, its people slaughtered. The bronze horses of the hippodrome were taken to Venice, and the empire was carved up like a carcass. For half a century, the city was ruled by Latin kings, but the Greeks returned, resilient as ever, and reclaimed their home. Yet the wound never healed. The empire that rose again was a shadow of its former self, smaller, poorer, besieged on all sides. And on the far horizon, another storm gathered. The Ottoman Turks, fierce and determined, their cannons already being cast. Byzantium had survived the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, and the betrayal of the West. But its time was running out. Still, in its art, in its faith, in its stubborn endurance, it carried the last light of the ancient world. It was Rome's final echo, the empire that refused to die.
The flames had long since gone out, but the smoke of empire still lingered across the world. Rome was gone, yet somehow it wasn't. It never truly could be, because Rome had never been only a city, or an emperor, or a people. It was an idea, and ideas, unlike marble or armies, do not burn so easily. In the ruins of Constantinople, the dust still clung to broken columns where mosaics once glittered under candlelight. The streets that had echoed with merchants, philosophers, and priests now lay silent, interrupted only by the whisper of wind across abandoned stones. But from those same stones, something eternal still breathed,
a memory of law and language, of ambition and endurance, of men and women who once looked at the horizon and believed they could rule the world. When the last emperor fell, when the double-headed eagle was torn from the palace gates, when the Hagia Sophia's bells were silenced beneath the call to prayer, the age of Rome truly ended. And yet, it did not die. The Ottoman conquerors who entered the city that day did not destroy it. They absorbed it, as conquerors always had. They stood upon the same marble floors where emperors had stood, and in that moment, unknowingly became a part of the same story. A story that stretched from the hills of Latium to the Bosphorus and far beyond. Because Rome's legacy was not confined to borders. It lived in the roads that still stitched continents together, in the laws that shaped kingdoms, in the Latin words that evolved into French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese. It lived in the architecture of cathedrals and palaces, in the dreams of emperors who came after. Even when men built new worlds across oceans, they named their capitals New Rome, Rome reborn, the eternal city once more. For every empire that rose after Rome became the shadow beneath it, the measuring line for all power, the ghost of glory that haunted every throne. From Charlemagne's coronation in the West to the czars of Russia calling themselves Caesars, the memory of Rome flowed like blood through the veins of the world. The Republic, the legions, the emperors, the saints, all became fragments of something too vast to die. And perhaps that was always Rome's true conquest, not of land, but of the human imagination. Even in the modern age, her imprint remains everywhere, subtle and stubborn. The letters you read, the roads you walk, the words you speak, all bear the touch of Latin hands. The idea that a people could build something eternal, something civilized, something ordered, that too was Roman. They built their empire not only with swords, but with structure, with ideas of governance, citizenship, and justice that outlasted any fortress wall. It is strange to think that it all began with a small village on 7 hills beside a muddy river, where farmers and shepherds once told tales of twin brothers raised by a wolf. From that myth came a monarchy, then a republic, then an empire, and finally a memory so vast that it still shapes how we see the world itself. 2,000 years later, we still live within the shadow of Rome, even when we no longer realize it. Some say Rome fell because of pride or decadence or divine punishment. Others say it simply evolved, that no empire truly dies, but only changes its form. Maybe they're both right, because even as the emperors turned to dust, the roads remained. Even as the statues crumbled, the stories endured. And even as time swept across continents, the Roman heartbeat carried on in the cities we built, the laws we wrote, the words we speak, and the symbols we still raise. Listen long enough, and you can still hear it. The rhythm of sandals striking ancient stones, the echo of commands shouted in Latin, the rustle of togas beneath marble arches, the faint murmur of fountains that once sparkled in the sun. The city itself may have fallen, but the sound of Rome, that steady, confident pulse, it never went quiet. It simply moved into everything. Because the truth is, Rome did not end when the last emperor died. It ended when we stopped remembering what it meant, when we forgot that the empire was never only about conquest. It was about the belief that humanity could build something greater than itself, that we could leave behind a structure so strong that even chaos could not destroy it. And so tonight, as the lights dim and silence begins to settle over you, think of that long winding thread of history stretching from the hills of Italy to the streets beneath your own feet. The stones may have changed, the voices may have faded, but the story continues. Rome still lives in every act of discipline, in every pursuit of greatness, in every human heart that refuses to surrender to time. It lives in the quiet confidence of civilization itself, in the unspoken belief that tomorrow can be built upon the bones of yesterday. And perhaps that is what makes Rome eternal. Not marble, not gold, not empire, but endurance. So close your eyes now and let the centuries blur. The legions have returned to their camps, the fires have burned low, and the marble forums rest under moonlight. The eternal city sleeps, but its dream continues. The dream of Rome, undying, unbroken, and still alive in us all. Thank you for joining this journey. May peace find you as the empire finally sleeps. If you made it all the way to the end, type in Roma Invicta, which means Rome unconquered. Good night, and sleep well, traveler.